The Jewish perspective on Palestine divides us, but the Muslim perspective brings us together. Palestine has come to symbolize an ethnic struggle between the Jewish people and the original Arab inhabitants of Palestine. That's a result of thinking in terms of the dominant secular narrative that thinks in terms of ethnic homelands and nation states. That divides us, it splits us apart. The Jewish narrative splits us apart too, even more, because it religiously affirms the racial and ethnic superiority of the Jewish people. But if we reframe the narrative in terms of the Muslim narrative, it brings us all together. The Muslim narrative brings the Palestinian people and the Jewish people, the children of Israel, together. It unites them. And that's what I'm going to show you in this video. Let's start with the Temple of Solomon. It was a magnificent building that was built by King Solomon about 3,000 years ago. And he dedicated it to the worship of one God. Some people might find that strange because they associate temples with idol worship. Greek temples, Roman temples, Hindu temples. But in English, the word temple doesn't have to be for idol worship. A temple is any building that's a religious building built for worship, regardless of whether it's built for the worship of idols or whether it's built for the worship of one God who's not an idol. So the Temple of Solomon was a building that was made for the worship of the one true God. That's just like the Kaaba. In fact, you could call the Kaaba the Temple of Abraham, because the Prophet Abraham built the Kaaba for the worship of one true God. He did it about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before Solomon built his temple in Jerusalem. There's actually evidence in Muslim sources in Sahih al-Bukhari that suggests that the Prophet Abraham, he was the one who first built the Temple of Solomon as well. But we're going to put that aside for now and just focus on the idea that the Temple of Solomon that was built in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago is a lot like the Temple of Abraham in Mecca today. You can see that very clearly if you go back to the Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word for temple, the word that's being translated as temple, is bait. And that's the same as the Arabic word bait. In Hebrew, the Temple of Solomon is called a bait that's dedicated to God. And in Arabic, the Kaaba is also called a bait that's dedicated to God. Now in English, when you have a building that's dedicated to the worship of a deity, then you translate it as temple, not as house. And that's why Jews and Christians, when they translated the word bait from Hebrew into English, they accurately chose the right word. They chose the word temple. But often when Muslims translate the word bait as it refers to the Kaaba in Mecca into English, they use the word house. And that creates misunderstandings because a house is something that people live in. And the house of God in Mecca, the Kaaba, is not something that God lives in. That's something that Muslims have said for a long time, and every Muslim believes that. Ibn Hajar, in his commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, he explains that what's meant by bait, when we say that the Kaaba is a bait, is not a house to live in, but a building that's made for the worship of God. And that's why a more accurate English translation of Baytullah, the Bayt of Allah, which is what we call the Kaaba, a more accurate English translation is the Temple of God, or the Temple of Abraham, if you want to ascribe it to the one who first built it, just as the Temple of Solomon, which is also called the Temple of God, is ascribed to Solomon, who, according to Christian and Jewish sources, was the one who first built that structure. There's another reason why we should also call the Kaaba a temple. When we call the Kaaba a temple, then when we speak to Jews and Christians and we talk about the Jewish narrative in the English language, we can actually bring everyone together. We can unite the Jewish narrative with the Muslim narrative, and we can show that Muslims and Jews are actually talking about the same thing and they're trying to do the same thing. So let's call the Kaaba the Temple of Abraham, and that enables us to see that they are both Bayt, they're both temples, and so they're similar. And now that verbal similarity between the name that's given to the Kaaba and the name that's given to the Temple of Solomon allows us to see other similarities. Both of these temples were places of pilgrimage. People would come from all over the world to venerate the name of the one God and to offer sacrifices to Him, animal sacrifices. The children of Israel would come from all over the world to make an annual pilgrimage to the Temple of Solomon and offer animal sacrifices. And that's a lot like what the Quran teaches Muslims to do. Muslims come from all over the world to perform an annual pilgrimage at the Kaaba, at the Temple of Abraham, to venerate the one true God and to offer a sacrifice. The pilgrimage is called Hajj, and the sacrifice is called the sacrifice of Eid al-Adha, which is one of the two great religious holidays of the Muslim world. There's also another similarity between the two temples. People all over the world have faced these two temples when they worship and pray to God. Let's start with the Temple of Solomon. The children of Israel used to face the Temple of Solomon. They used to face it when they worshipped God, and this worship was very similar to the way that Muslims worship God today. That worship has now been forgotten out of centuries of neglect. But if you go back to the Bible, you'll find that it says that the prophets of the children of Israel fell on their faces, that they bowed, that they kneeled when they worshipped God, just like Muslims do at least 5 times a day today all over the world. It's now well accepted in academic scholarship that prostration used to be an essential part of Jewish worship at the Temple of Solomon. And all of this confirms Muslim accounts of the great prophets and righteous people of the children of Israel. There's verses in the Quran that describe the children of Israel worshiping in this way. And there's also stories in Muslim historical accounts of Jews and Christians who were alive around the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who had this kind of prayer that they used to pray, and they used to face the Temple of Solomon. You can find detailed references for all of this in the description below. So the Jewish narrative of the Temple of Solomon is like the Muslim narrative of the Temple of Abraham, the Kaaba. But the Muslim narrative goes even further. It doesn't just affirm another narrative in Arabia that's like the narrative in Jerusalem. It actually affirms the Jewish narrative in Jerusalem. It affirms that the Temple of Solomon actually existed and that it was dedicated to the worship of the one true God. It affirms that the children of Israel were chosen by that one true God. It affirms that God chose them to be custodians of His holy temple in Jerusalem. And it affirms that God chose them by filling them with prophets and saints and righteous people who worshipped God alone, who obeyed Him, submitted to Him completely, and who were models of righteousness for everyone all over the world. So the Quran affirms the Jewish narrative. In fact, it affirms the Jewish narrative even more than the Jewish narrative affirms itself. Let me explain what that means. In the Jewish narrative, King Solomon was somebody who vied for power. He struggled for power in order to become king. An unpleasant series of events happened, not becoming of a righteous person. And according to the Jewish narrative, he also fell into idolatry. He worshipped gods apart from God. The Quran explicitly exonerates him. It says, وَمَا كَفَرَ سُلَيْمَانَ. Sulaiman never disbelieved. And it upholds Solomon as a great prophet of God who was divinely protected from sin. It praises Solomon even more than the Jewish narrative does. It praises David even more than the Jewish narrative does. In fact, it praises all of the prophets of the children of Israel even more than the Jewish narrative does. Something that nobody would expect, because everybody would think that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was setting himself up as a competitor to these previous prophets, but he wasn't. The Quran teaches the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to hold these great children of Israel who were chosen by God as models of guidance for all of mankind. After mentioning Abraham and Isaac and Moses and David and many other prophets of the children of Israel, after mentioning all of these prophets, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He tells the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَى اللَّهِ. Those are the great ones who Allah had guided, who Allah has truly guided. فَبِهُدَاهُ مُقْتَدِهِ. And so take their guidance alone as your exemplar. Take it as the only thing that you follow. In fact, what most people don't realize is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't always face the temple of Abraham in Mecca when he prayed. In fact, he faced the temple of Solomon in Jerusalem for longer than he faced the temple of Abraham in Mecca. And I'll tell you more about that in the next video.